Well, hello one and all, and welcome to this new training on lighting, shading and rendering in Lightwave 3D. Through this training we're going to take you through Lightwave's complete system for surfacing and shading, lighting your models, all of the different rendering options, and how to use all of these tools together to get great looking final renders. Before we start, I just want to take you through a couple of small important notices for the road ahead. Firstly, this training is designed for Lightwave version 2018 and higher. If you're on an earlier version of Lightwave, then you will find some useful stuff, but it's primarily all contained here in the Foundations section. The later sections have very little for you in that respect. The reason being that with Lightwave 2018 we have an all new rendering engine, and all of its parts and components are completely changed and updated. And it's all of this stuff that we are going to be exploring here. I should really explain the structure of the training a little bit. What we have here, of course, is lighting, shading and rendering. And the reason that we've got all of this together is because it's really part of one big interconnected whole. The lighting system, material shading system, and of course the main renderer are the three pillars of the whole thing. So it makes sense to have a training that covers all of them as a whole piece. The result of this cross-support and interdependence of the three parts on our shading and rendering workflows is thus that it can be hard to draw a nice straight line through everything. If you've seen other trainings of mine like the rigging or the animation training, you'll know that we take things in a progressive stage, work out all of the bits individually and then show how they work together. That's not so easy to do with these systems. So whilst this training tries to be as straight and linear from the basics forward as possible, and in many ways it is, you will find that there is a bit of dancing around from topic to topic. We'll mention something in materials, not go in depth. Later when we're talking about lighting it'll become important and we'll explore it there. And so the training's structured in what seems like this slightly disjointed way. But the main thing that we're trying to do is just show where the main and most important connections between different things are. I promise you it'll all make sense in the end, however, and I hope you'll be okay with this sort of path through these topics. This new engine is a fully PBR or physically based rendering solution. It takes many of the strengths that we've seen historically in Lightwave's renderer and builds on them. If you're newer to Lightwave and you're looking at it in terms of other engines that are out there, you'll probably find it most similar to things like Arnold or perhaps V-Ray, in terms of its workings, its quality, and so on. If you've been with Lightwave for a while and you're used to previous versions, then you are going to notice quite a good few changes with this new rendering engine. You will find many things are quite similar. We have a newly designed surface editor with lots of lovely ready-made PBR materials. We have new shading models for either photorealistic or indeed cell shade modes. Our surfacing is primarily done via nodal, though in places we do still have texture layers available. Our lighting setup is quite familiar, though our lights are fully redone for PBR behaviour, and we have a full set of render buffers available to us for compositing or visual effects type workflows. Add to this a really good GI system, new network rendering capabilities, and all in all we've got ourselves something pretty special. If you're looking for a little bit of additional instruction and guidance on PBR and the details, then I recommend this is a good thing to look at. This is from Allegorithmic, the same guys who produce Substance Painter, which is a couple of PDFs. You can see the link for that here, and there's 2 volumes of it, and this will take you through a lot of the theory or the basic principles behind PBR work like this. Most of the stuff here in the first PDF is what you really need to know, and the second one will go into a bit more detail on some of the particular details or idiosyncrasies of certain surface types. So I recommend you have a peek at these 2 and a read through if you want to get an overview of this stuff from a slightly different point of view or a slightly different way of explanation. If you're not so completely au fait with the ideas of PBR workflow, then it helps to, gather up more points of view of the same sort of stuff. Now, whilst you will, if you are familiar with previous Lightwave versions, find an awful lot of familiarity in the interface for the new renderer, That familiarity does mask a great many of the changes that have taken place, and you will find that in a great many circumstances things do behave very differently. As such, it's very important to point out that coming from earlier versions, you are going to find something of a hump to get over with this new rendering engine. Some of the approaches and the workflows that you've used for lighting or surfacing just aren't going to work out in the same way anymore. Most especially those that weren't strictly PBR that we could get away with much easier before. There are a couple of areas of this adjustment that can throw you coming from earlier versions of Light. The first is the workflow adjustment coupled with, as we've mentioned, the familiarity of the interface. It has been kept nice and familiar, but of course the underneath stuff works quite different. Setting up and dialing in all of the different settings that we need in all the different places. In 2018, along the same sort of lines as what we would expect to see in 2015 or earlier, then we might see quite different results. So the first hump is, of course, learning all of the, little tool specifics so that you can adjust fully to working in the 2018 way. The other, of course, is if you're bringing in existing assets that you had in 2015 and earlier. All of the main render settings on those scenes won't necessarily be ideal for 2018, either in terms of look or in terms of render time optimization. But surfaces, since they're handled differently, can also be here or there. When it comes to such, there is an auto-converter, of course. When you are bringing in assets from earlier versions of Lightwave, then 2018 will attempt to adjust those automatically to the new system. Of course, a lot depends on how those surfaces were set up. Sometimes it's more successful, sometimes less. And also the design of your surface and the intention behind it and how PBR it was or wasn't will contribute to the success or not success of having the same surface look good straight away. Of course, if you are intending to use large numbers of existing assets, especially if you're doing stuff like ArcViz, where you might be relying on libraries of objects and their surfaces, and you consider as well the having to adapt to a new workflow, perhaps rebuild lighting in scene to get everything looking right and optimized for render. Then all put together, it can make the transition into 2018 a little frustrating at the start. However, what I can tell you about using it is this. In following all the workflows and using a mixture of different surfacing and lighting setups and workflows for different types of objects or different types of scenes, have different requirements or different levels of detail, then what I overall find is that in general, the renders in 2018 just look better straight away, when of course done at a very basic level at least of being done properly. And in terms of quality for speed, I find on pretty much every type of scene or subject I can get as good a render or better in the same render time or less than I could in earlier versions of Lightwave. So whilst it's a different beast and hard to make direct straight comparisons on certain surface types or scene lighting setups and the like, when trying to match and balance quality and look, artifacts and all of that sort of stuff, I find that you do get better performance, and when you put it together you do get really lovely renders. Of course, actually this whole thing of doing it properly isn't that big a chore. Because PBR is throughout the renderer, it straight away gives you a head start on the whole process. One of the things that has always been part of Lightwave's legacy that its users have loved has been its speed and immediacy of getting things done. People have always liked the straightforward workflow, sensible options, and of course a good renderer, which has allowed them to get pretty good looking result with less effort and less time than they might have done in other applications. It's always had that feeling of immediacy. 2018 not only preserves this great aspect of Lightwave, it positively doubles down on it. When I get in and start setting up full scenes with multiple effects and complex surfaces, I've been able to get renders with more speed and ease and less work and go from basic object with basic surfacing to something really good finished scene in pretty much record time, faster than I've ever been able to do with Lightwave in the past. In this respect, 2018 has become a huge step forward. The workflow, whilst different, once you get used to it, once you know what all the bits do, makes a great load of sense, makes it very easy to navigate, and essentially just dial in the quality that you want. And all this together, I find, means that in spite of the hump of adjusting to and learning a new workflow, in spite of the pain of, having to refresh and redo possibly many pre-existing assets in order to bring them into 2018, despite all of those little transitional hiccups, I think that it is absolutely worth every drop of effort. It's a fantastic renderer, gives fantastic result, and it's made Lightwave more fantastic. Been a great, huge step forward for us. At least that is what I would have to say about that. There are a couple of reasons for this whole switch to PBR. First is simply the look and the quality. You get much better looking renders when everything is structured around PBR, not only your own workflow and your own setting up of surfaces, but all of the architecture of Lightwave itself, the renderer, the lighting, and so on. Because it's all designed around this single way of working, helps you get to good results more quickly. And one of the really big things that I find is great for general workflow is the consistency that you get out of it. Previously in Lightwave, it's not been at all uncommon to take some assets and you put them in one scene and you put on your textures, your surfaces, and you light them and you do your render, and you get it looking good and looking nice, and then you take those same assets into a different scene with some other assets and different lighting, and suddenly it doesn't look quite as good anymore, and you either have to completely retweak the lighting, or more often you have to go and start tweaking materials, and this can be a real pain and a workflow killer overall. What you will find working with 2018 is that there is just so much more consistency. You get something set up and looking good in one instance, you take it into an entirely different scene, totally different lighting, and it still looks good. It still looks like you would expect it to under those conditions, and you don't need to go and start fiddling around trying to tweak specific material parameters to get it look the way that you would have expected it to. And this, of course, has an impact on your workflow overall, not just on that one object or one scene, but of course when you are doing many scenes that use or reuse objects time and again, or when you have to bring surfaced objects from different scenes into a new scene together, they sit together and look great. And once you've worked with it a little bit and set up a few objects and a few scenes and taken them from place to place, you'll see just how much of a boon and a help that really, really is. With that said then, a couple of little points of housekeeping before we move forward. Firstly, you might have noticed I mentioned that Lightwave surfacing has very much gone into the nodal way of working. It's not the only method you have available. The older methods of using texture layers are still there. But to make the most of this, you really do need to get further into nodes. If you haven't done so, then do pop over here to my YouTube channel and have a look at the foundation section of my nodal tutorials. The whole series, of course, is very good and helpful for learning the node stuff, but this foundation section really covers all the bases that you need to know for the training that we're going to do here. So make sure to give that a once over if you've not already. Next thing, we are going to be going pretty much entirely native in Lightwave here. However, there will just be the odd place where we call on something external. In terms of plugins, that's going to be next to nothing, save for a few instances where we use the DP Sky plugin here. And that's really just going to be to give us a nice sky backdrop rather than having to use an image map all the time. But for occasions where we do use image maps, we're going to use the SIBL archive here at HDRI Labs. Lots of nice high quality HDRs here that we can grab and use. And you'll see us turn to one or two of those along the way when we're doing backdrop or GI work. We'll also occasionally here and there be pulling the odd other resource from the internet, but we'll just show those as and when we need them. During this whole business, of course, we will see, a number of renders being done and different render times, especially when we're talking about optimization and working on projects and trying to manage all of that stuff in that way. As such, it pays to mention what we're actually going to be using and rendering on here. These videos are done back and forth between two different workstations. One is a 6-core Phenom 2 AMD, and the other is an Intel Core i5. They wind up giving roughly about the same performance as one another. Some scenes are a little quicker on one, some a little quicker on the other. But overall, they're pretty similar. Also, of course, these are both typical, nothing fancy at all machines. Perhaps not uncommon that you watching this might have or use such a machine somewhere along the line. But I'm sure a good number of you, of course, also have much faster machines. So you can perhaps try one or two of the content pieces and see how you perform in comparison if you want to see what sort of times you should be expecting in other areas as we're looking at those. So, with all of that covered, we are then going to get started. The first thing that we're going to do is go through the foundation section, wherein we are going to explain some of the details of PBR rendering, or physically based rendering. To this end, Lightwave does a lot of the heavy lifting for us, but to make the best of it, it's really going to be helpful to understand exactly what it is Lightwave's trying to do and why it is doing things in a certain way. And of course, there may well be situations where we need to set things up ourselves to obey a PBR style workflow. So we'll take you through all of that stuff before then moving on to all of the details of the tools and the workflows available to us in 2018. And thus, with all of that said, let's get started.